Hello and welcome to Arohan Coaching Institute. Today we will discuss the First World War in details. So let's get started. World War I, also known as the Great War, began in 1914 after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria. His murder catapulted into a war across Europe that lasted until 1918. During the conflict, Germany, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria and the Ottoman Empire, the Central Powers, fought against Great Britain, France, Russia, Italy, Romania, Japan and the United States, the Allied powers. Thanks to new military technologies and the horrors of trench warfare, World War I saw unprecedented levels of carnage and destruction. By the time the war was over and the Allied powers claimed victory, more than 16 million people, soldiers and civilians alike, were dead. Let's dig deep into the facts, figures, and details about the First World War of the humankind and understand what went wrong. In 1914, Europe still dominated the rest of the world. Most of the decisions which shaped the fate of the world were taken in the capitals of Europe. Germany was the leading power in Europe, both militarily and economically. She had overtaken Britain in the production of pig iron and steel, though not quite in coal, while France, Belgium, Italy, and Austria-Hungary were well behind. Russian industry was expanding rapidly, but had been so backward to begin with that she could not seriously challenge Germany and Britain. Japan too had modernized rapidly and was a major power to be reckoned with after defeating Russia in 1905. The European powers had taken part in a great burst of imperialist expansion in the years after 1880. Most of Africa was taken over by the European states in what became known as the Scramble for Africa. The idea behind it was mainly to get control of new markets and new sources of raw materials. There was also intervention in the crumbling Chinese empire. The European powers, the USA and Japan, all at different times, forced the helpless Chinese to grant trading concessions. Europe had divided itself into two alliance systems. The Triple Alliance consisted of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. And the Triple Entente was among Britain, France, and Russia. In addition, Japan and Britain had signed an alliance in 1902. There was a growing naval rivalry between Britain and Germany. France was also angry over the loss of Alsace and Lorraine to Germany at the end of the Franco-Prussian War in 1871. The Germans accused Britain, Russia, and France of trying to encircle them just like today's China accuses Quad Group. While France was preparing to take over Morocco, the Germans announced that they would assist the Sultan of Morocco to maintain his country's independence and demanded an international conference to discuss its future. A conference was duly held in southern Spain in January 1906. The British, who had just signed the Entente Cordiale with France, were determined to lead the opposition to Germany at the conference. To the amazement of the Germans, Britain, Russia, Italy, and Spain supported the French demand to control the Moroccan bank and police. It was a serious diplomatic defeat for the Germans, who realized that the new lineup of Britain and France was a force to be reckoned with. Russia's defeat by Japan in the War of 1905 seemed to suggest that the Russians were no longer much of a military threat. The outbreak of revolution in Russia in January 1905 had weakened the country internally. In October 1905, when the Tsar granted the Russian people freedom of speech and the right to have an elected parliament, the British began to feel more kindly disposed towards the Tsarist system. It made agreement possible, and the two governments were able therefore to settle their remaining differences. The Bosnia Crisis, 1908. The crisis over Bosnia, a province of Turkey, brought the tension between Austria-Hungary and Serbia. In 1878, the Congress of Berlin had reached the rather confusing decision that Bosnia should remain officially part of the Ottoman Empire, but that Austria-Hungary should be allowed to administer it. This was a deliberate blow at the neighboring state of Serbia, which had also been hoping to take Bosnia. The Serbs appealed for help to the Russians, who called for a European conference, expecting French and British support. When it became clear that Germany would support Austria in the event of war, the French drew back, unwilling to become involved in a war in the Balkans. The British, anxious to avoid a breach with Germany, did no more than protest to Austria-Hungary. The Russians, still smarting from their defeat by Japan, dared not risk another war without the support of their allies. And so Bosnia remained under the control of Austria. The assassination of the Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand. The Archduke, nephew and heir to the Emperor Franz Joseph, was paying an official visit to Sarajevo in June 1914 to inspect the imperial armed forces in Bosnia. The annexation of Bosnia by Austro-Hungary had angered Serbian nationalists, who believed the territories should be part of Serbia. A group of young nationalists hatched a plot to kill the Archduke during his visit to Sarajevo, and after some missteps, 19-year-old Gavrilo Princip was able to shoot the royal couple at point-blank range while they travelled in their official procession, killing both almost instantly. The Austrians blamed the Serb government and sent a harsh ultimatum. The Serbs accepted most of the demands in it, but the Austrians, with a promise of German support, were determined to use the incident as an excuse for war. Convinced that Austria-Hungary was readying for war, the Serbian government ordered the Serbian army to mobilize and appealed to Russia for assistance. On 28 July, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. The Russians, anxious not to let the Serbs down again, ordered a general mobilization on 29 July. The German government demanded Russia that this should be cancelled on 31 July. And when the Russians failed to comply, Germany declared war on Russia on 1 August and on France on 3 August. Germany began fighting the war onto France, invading France through neutral Belgium in the west and confronting Russia in the east. When German troops entered Belgium on their way to invade France, Britain, who in 1839 had promised to defend Belgium, demanded the German troops' withdrawal. When this demand was ignored by Germany, Britain entered the war on 4 August. Austria-Hungary declared war on Russia on 6 August 1914. Italy joined the Allies in May 1915, while Serbia, Japan, and Belgium also fought alongside the Allies. The USA too joined the force in April 1917. The war turned out to be quite different from what most people had anticipated. It was widely expected to be a short, decisive affair, like other recent European wars. In Eastern Europe, there was more movement, with early Russian successes against the Austrians, who constantly had to be helped out by the Germans. This caused friction between Austrians and Germans. But by December 1917, the Germans had captured Poland, which was a Russian territory back then, and forced the Russians out of the war. Britain, suffering heavy losses of merchant ships through submarine attacks, and France, whose armies were paralyzed by mutiny, seemed on the verge of defeat. The Germans found themselves just east of Paris. They penetrated to within 20 miles of Paris, but the nearer they got to Paris, the more the German impetus slowed up. There were problems in keeping the armies supplied with food and ammunition. The troops were also exhausted by the long marches in the August heat. In September, the faltering Germans were attacked by the French under Joffre in the Battle of the Marne. They were driven back to the river Aisne, where they were able to dig trenches. This battle was vitally important. Some historians regard it as one of the most decisive battles in modern history. Gradually, the tide turned. The Allies, helped by the entry of the USA in April 1917. This was caused partly by the German U-boat campaign, and also by the discovery that Germany was trying to persuade Mexico to declare war on the USA, promising her Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona in return. The Americans had hesitated about siding with the autocratic Russian government, but the overthrow of the Tsar in the March Revolution removed this obstacle. The USA made an important contribution to the Allied victory. They supplied Britain and France with food, merchant ships, and most importantly credit, though actual military help came slowly. By the end of 1917, only one American division had been in action, but by mid-1918 over 500,000 men were involved. Most important were the psychological boost, which the American potential in resources of men and materials gave the Allies, and the corresponding blow it gave to German morale. Soon German morale went down, whose last despairing attempt at a decisive breakthrough in France failed in the spring of 1918. The success of the British Navy in blockading German ports and defeating the submarine threat by defending convoys of merchant ships was also telling on the Germans. By late summer of 1918, they were nearing exhaustion, though Germany itself had hardly been invaded. A controversial peace settlement was signed at Versailles the following year, which marked the end of World War I. The impact of the war was extraordinarily wide-ranging, which was not surprising given that it was the first total war in history. This means that it involved not just armies and navies but entire populations. And it was the first big conflict between modern, industrialized nations. New methods of warfare and new weapons were introduced. Tanks, submarines, bombers, machine guns, heavy artillery and mustard gas. With so many men away in the armed forces, women had to take their places in factories and in other jobs which had previously been carried out by men. In the Central Powers and in Russia, the civilian populations suffered severe hardships caused by the blockades. In all the European states involved in the war, governments organized ordinary people as never before. A sizable proportion of an entire generation of young men had perished. France, for example, lost around 20% of men of military age. The Treaty of Versailles with Germany. German armaments were strictly limited to a maximum of 1 lakh troops, and no conscription, no tanks, no armored cars, military aircraft, or submarines, and only 6 battleships. Alsace and Lorraine were given back to France. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, which had been handed over to Germany by Russia in the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, were taken away from Germany and set up as independent states. Germany was to pay reparations for damage done to the Allies. The actual amount was not decided at Versailles, but it was announced later in 1921, after much argument and haggling, as £6,600 million. A League of Nations was formed. Its aims and organization were set out in the League Covenant and stop wars like the First World War from happening. The Germans had little choice but to sign the treaty, though they objected strongly. The signing ceremony took place in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles.